The beginning of Facebook seemed like something simple and unpretentious. In 2003, Mark Zuckerberg, then a young Harvard student, had an innovative idea: to connect his peers on a platform where they could share information, interact, and build an online community. It was a revolutionary idea, but one limited to the university campus. The foundation was simple and functional, an extension of the human desire to socialize and connect with others. At that moment, no one could have predicted that something so harmless would transform into a global tool of power and manipulation. At first, Mark worked on the project alone, but he soon realized he needed help. That's when he partnered with other students, including Eduardo Saverin, Andrew McCullum, Dustin Moskovitz, and Chris Hughes. The group was excited about the possibilities and worked tirelessly to improve the platform. The Facebook, as it was initially called, began to gain traction among Harvard students, becoming a local craze within weeks. The idea was so promising that it quickly started attracting curious attention from other institutions. Over time, the site's popularity grew beyond the walls of Harvard. Other universities began adopting the platform, and the team decided to expand its reach even further. Mark, obsessed with making the idea work, spent sleepless nights programming and fine-tuning details. He believed he was creating something that would change the world, but he had no idea of the kind of interest this project would spark. Investors began to emerge, and the platform quickly evolved from a student project into something much bigger. Behind all the excitement, signs already pointed to the fact that things would not be as simple as they seemed. Mark's friends began to notice his growing obsession with the site's success. He seemed increasingly distant, as if the idea of connecting the world was more significant than any personal relationship. Even so, no one questioned Mark's vision, which already showed hints of his ambitious and calculating personality. The team trusted him, unaware that success would come at a very high price. The turning point came when the first real investors appeared. Sean Parker, co-founder of Napster, entered the scene, bringing not only money but also a broader vision of how the site could grow into a global powerhouse. With Parker came connections to prominent entrepreneurs and institutions interested in supporting Facebook's growth. Mark seemed to be on the right track, but this foray into the corporate world marked the beginning of his transformation. The university project was leaving behind its small, idealistic roots. The Facebook was finally launched to the public in 2004, dropping the from its name. Now simply Facebook, it was ready to become what Mark had always dreamed of, a global social network. But like many stories of ascent, success brought forces beyond the creator's control. From this point forward, Facebook began to attract the interest of people and organizations with goals very different from Mark's original dream. The simplicity of the idea would soon be overshadowed by far more sinister intentions. With Facebook's meteoric rise, Mark Zuckerberg began to change perceptibly. The shy, reserved Harvard student transformed into someone colder, more calculating, and obsessed with control. His friends and colleagues noticed this change, but attributed it to the pressure of handling such a massive project. After all, Mark was dealing with investors, expectations, and the creation of something unprecedented. What no one knew was that this transformation went far beyond stress. There was something dark beginning to take hold of him. Initially, the changes seemed small, almost imperceptible. Mark began to isolate himself more, preferring to work alone rather than share ideas with his friends. Meetings, once relaxed and full of energy, became tense. He spoke less, but his presence dominated the room in an almost intimidating way. The obsession with controlling the platform was evident. Mark wanted to oversee every detail, rejecting opposing opinions and ignoring any criticism. It seemed he was building something more than just a social network. Some of his closest friends began to notice that Mark was becoming obsessed with data. He talked about the power of information with a strange gleam in his eyes, as if seeing something no one else could comprehend. "People trust us with their information, and they don't even know what they're giving us," he once said during a meeting. The comment was met with nervous laughter, but no one was sure if he was joking or serious. That phrase would later be remembered as one of the first signs of something bigger. The changes weren't limited to his personality. Mark began to show physical signs of wear. His eyes were sunken, his skin paler, and his once relaxed posture now appeared rigid. Some said he was merely tired, but others were convinced there was more to it. There was an aura around him that made people uneasy, as if something was draining his energy, transforming him into someone unrecognizable. Even so, he continued working tirelessly, driven by a force no one could understand. Mark's decisions also began to reflect this transformation. He started accepting business proposals he would have previously rejected, saying they were necessary for the platform's growth. Some friends tried to confront him, questioning his choices, but he pushed them away. "You don't understand what I'm trying to do here," he once said with an unsettling calm. It was as if he was following a plan only he knew, something bigger than the very idea of connecting people. At the same time, rumors began to circulate. Some close to Mark said he was having meetings with mysterious figures, men in suits who didn't seem to be just investors. Others claimed he spent hours locked in his office, working on something no one else had access to. The team, though concerned, didn't dare question him directly. The project was too big to fail, and Mark was the mind behind it all. However, for those who knew him well, it was clear something was profoundly wrong. Facebook's success quickly caught the attention of groups far beyond the tech sector. Initially, investors were the only ones interested in funding the platform, but soon government agents began to appear. These men, always well-dressed and with calculated words, approached Mark with tempting proposals. From all indications, it wasn't just financial investments. There was something more at play. The presence of these agents marked the start of a new phase for Facebook, one that would cease to be merely a social network. FBI agents were the first to approach. They presented Mark with a compelling vision, using Facebook as a national security tool. The argument was simple and persuasive. With millions of users sharing personal information, it would be possible to identify suspicious behaviors and predict potential threats. The project wouldn't just be profitable, it would be a patriotic service. Mark initially resisted, but the idea that his creation could be a key piece in national security began to plant a seed of doubt. These meetings were always discreet, held in isolated locations with few details shared with the team. The agents brought documents, diagrams, and reports showing how Facebook could be used to track movements, identify patterns, and create detailed profiles of individuals. Mark listened attentively, but his friends noticed he seemed more distant and focused after each meeting, as if processing information no one else had access to. Shortly after, another group entered the scene, CIA agents. Unlike the FBI, their approach was deeper and more unsettling. They didn't just talk about surveillance, but about social control. The idea was to use Facebook not just to observe, but to shape behaviors. With the right data, it would be possible to influence political decisions, manipulate public opinions, and even predict uprisings before they occurred. Facebook wouldn't just be a social network, it would be a tool of domination. These meetings with the CIA marked Mark's definitive transformation. He began accepting the proposals with less resistance, seeing the potential power he could gain. The platform, once an idea to connect people, was now becoming a machine of control. The CIA offered more than money. They offered protection, immunity, and unlimited resources. Mark was being seduced by something far greater than he could comprehend. For Mark's team, these changes were alarming. They noticed he became increasingly reserved, avoiding discussions and keeping crucial information to himself. Some even tried to investigate what was happening, but were quickly pushed away. Mark was being manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension, but, at the same time, seemed willing to embrace the role offered to him. The young visionary was disappearing, replaced by someone far colder and more dangerous. What began as a social network to connect people was quickly shaped into something far more sinister. The FBI, in its initial meetings with Zuckerberg, presented a proposal that seemed both bold and disturbing: to transform Facebook into a massive surveillance tool. They argued that the platform was perfect for this, since users voluntarily shared personal details that, in any other context, would take months or years to collect through government agents. Mark, though hesitant at first, began to see the potential of this proposal. The agent's justification was clear: national security. The world was changing rapidly, and new threats were emerging every day. With Facebook, it would be possible to identify suspicious behaviors, track connections between individuals, and even predict actions before they happened. It was like creating a nervous system for the government, where every post, like, and message would be analyzed for danger signals. Mark, still young and impressionable, was seduced by this vision, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. The proposal didn't just involve monitoring, but also categorizing users based on their behaviors. Groups would be identified and separated by interests, beliefs, and tendencies. This classification would allow the government to act preventively against potential threats, neutralizing dangers before they manifested. The agents explained this as a natural extension of technology, but in reality, it was a form of social control that stripped individuals of autonomy. For Mark, the possibility of turning Facebook into something indispensable for the government seemed irresistible. However, there was a cost. To implement this system, Mark would have to relinquish control of part of Facebook. Confidential user information would need to be shared with government agencies, something that went directly against the platform's initial purpose. During a meeting, he tried to argue against the idea, insisting that Facebook should be a space for freedom and connection. But the agents were relentless, emphasizing that security was a priority and that he would be doing the right thing. Over time, Mark's resistance began to wane. He knew he was being pressured, but also started to believe that the power offered to him was a unique opportunity. He justified to himself that, with enough control, he could steer Facebook toward a greater good. However, every step he took toward the agreement with the government distanced him further from his original vision. The idea of connecting people was being replaced by the promise of power and global influence. The initial proposal for massive surveillance was partially accepted, but with conditions. Mark demanded enough autonomy to continue developing the platform as he wished, while government agencies would have access to the data in the background. This agreement marked the beginning of a new era for Facebook. It ceased to be an idealistic project and became a tool of control, something that would transform the lives of billions of people without them even realizing it. As Facebook grew, Mark Zuckerberg's meetings with mysterious figures became increasingly frequent. These meetings, always held in discreet locations away from public view, were the center of decisions that would shape the platform's future. Mark, once an accessible and open young man, now seemed a man of secrets, driven by intentions even his closest friends could not understand. The content of these meetings was a mystery to everyone, but the impact was visible in his personality. The initial meetings were organized by government agents. They chose remote locations like abandoned warehouses or discreet buildings in urban areas. Mark was always escorted by men who protected him, but also ensured he didn't share anything discussed. When he returned from these meetings, he seemed tense, burdened by a weight no one could lift. It was evident that what happened inside was far more than simple financial negotiations. Over time, the meetings began to involve other figures besides government agents. Powerful businessmen, scientists, and even individuals with no clear connections to the corporate world started appearing. These people talked about cutting-edge technology, artificial intelligence, and the future of global communication. However, there were also discussions about human behavior, mass manipulation, and how Facebook could be used to guide people's decisions. Mark absorbed everything, increasingly fascinated by the possibilities. These meetings began to drastically shape Zuckerberg's decisions. He started implementing changes on Facebook that were not clearly justified, but seemed to follow an invisible logic. Simple platform features, like news feed algorithms, were altered to prioritize certain types of content, manipulating what users saw. No one knew for sure who was truly behind these changes, but the effects were undeniable. Facebook was becoming more than a social network, it was an influence machine. The meetings also began to spark rumors among the few who knew about them. Some said Mark was being threatened, forced to cooperate with a larger plan. Others believed he had voluntarily gotten involved, seduced by the power promised to him. Mark himself seemed divided. At times, he showed signs of resistance, but on other occasions, he seemed completely committed to what was being proposed. The internal struggle he faced was beginning to consume him. The secret meetings continued for years, becoming increasingly intense and involving even more mysterious figures. At one point, Mark disappeared for weeks, with no one knowing where he was or who he was meeting with. When he returned, it was evident that something had changed. He was no longer the same. His decisions became bolder, almost arrogant, as if he had access to knowledge no one else possessed. The meetings had transformed Mark into something completely different, and Facebook now followed a path only he understood. Over the years, the changes in Mark Zuckerberg became impossible to ignore. He was no longer the young Harvard innovator, full of enthusiasm and passion for his idea. His physical appearance began to deteriorate alarmingly. His skin became pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, once bright and expressive, now seemed empty, as if he was constantly exhausted or consumed by something invisible to others. Beyond the physical changes, his behavior also underwent significant alterations. Mark, who had always been meticulous and detail-oriented, began exhibiting almost obsessive traits. He seemed unable to relax or disconnect from work, dedicating every moment to Facebook. Friends and family began noticing that he avoided personal conversations and seemed increasingly disinterested in anything not related to the platform's expansion. To many, he was becoming a machine, driven solely by numbers and algorithms. The emotional impact of this transformation was evident in his interactions. Mark, who once inspired those around him, now seemed to generate discomfort. There was something about his presence that unsettled others, as if he was always hiding something. During meetings, he rarely made eye contact, and his words were chosen with an almost frightening coldness. He was no longer the young visionary. He was someone who had lost something essential, something human. Close colleagues began reporting strange incidents involving Mark. He often disappeared for long periods, reappearing with vague explanations. Rumors circulated that he was in contact with powerful, possibly dangerous individuals. Some even suggested he was involved with something beyond the government or corporate world, something that was slowly consuming his soul. No one dared confront him directly, but everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The worst part was that Mark seemed to accept these changes without resistance. When confronted by old friends, he responded with indifference, as if he no longer cared. "It's all part of the process," he once said to a colleague who questioned his health. It was as if he believed that what he was sacrificing, his health, his emotions, his humanity, was necessary to achieve something greater. To him, Facebook was not just a project, it was a purpose. As his appearance and behavior continued to deteriorate, many began questioning what was truly happening. Was Mark being consumed by his ambition, or by something larger and darker? Were the physical and emotional changes the result of pressure and incessant work, or were they signs of involvement in something no one could comprehend? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing was clear: Mark Zuckerberg was no longer the same. The presence of government agents already seemed unsettling enough, but what truly marked Mark Zuckerberg's transformation was the emergence of something beyond human comprehension. One night, during one of the secret meetings he held, something happened. It wasn't just men in suits discussing technology and national security. Something more was present. It was then that the first evidence of a non-human force began to reveal itself: the reptilians. Mark had been seen entering a windowless building, accompanied by expressionless men. A curious student who followed him reported hearing strange sounds coming from inside the building. Muffled voices, guttural whispers, and then something that sounded like a roar. The sound didn't seem human. The student, terrified, fled before discovering what was really happening. But he wasn't the only one to notice something was wrong that night. The reptilians, described in various theories as interdimensional or extraterrestrial beings, were figures few would believe to be real. However, everything began to make sense as the changes in Mark became more evident. Witnesses who had the courage to speak about the encounters said these beings were imposing, with scaly skin and glowing eyes that seemed to penetrate the minds of those who met their gaze. They didn't speak with words but communicated telepathically, transmitting ideas and orders that could not be disobeyed. These beings weren't just interested in Facebook as a social network. For them, the project was the perfect tool for something much bigger: the manipulation and control of humanity. Data collection was just the beginning. The reptilians wanted to study human emotions, understand behavioral patterns, and eventually use them to achieve total control. They saw Facebook as the perfect experiment, a global laboratory where they could observe and manipulate billions of people simultaneously. Mark, it seems, became an intermediary between the reptilians and the human world. Initially, he seemed reluctant, but the allure of power offered by these beings was irresistible. They promised access to advanced technologies, a greater understanding of the universe, and most importantly, a prominent place in the new world they were creating. Mark, driven by his ambition and perhaps by the direct influence of these creatures, began to yield. His physical and emotional transformation seemed to be part of a larger process, something he accepted as the price to pay. Evidence of the reptilians' involvement became increasingly difficult to ignore. Reports of encounters in forests, strange lights in the sky, and mysterious disappearances began to emerge. Some of these stories were suppressed, but others reached the public, dismissed as conspiracy theories. However, those close to Mark knew the truth. He had crossed a line of no return, and Facebook was no longer just a surveillance tool. It was the foundation for a global experiment led by forces beyond human comprehension. Initially, the presence of the FBI and CIA agents seemed frightening but understandable. After all, the government often gets involved in high-impact technological projects. However, everything changed when the meetings began involving the reptilians. These beings, much older than humanity itself, were treated by the agents as allies in a larger plan. It was evident that the relationship between them had existed for years, and that Facebook was just another piece on the chessboard. The reptilians were not interested in money or political power, as both were irrelevant to them. What they truly sought was total control over humanity, not through physical force but mental and emotional manipulation. The partnership with U.S. government agencies was based on mutual interests. The government provided the human and technological resources necessary to collect data, while the reptilians brought their advanced technologies and knowledge of human behavior. Mark Zuckerberg was quickly inserted into this relationship as a central figure. He became the perfect intermediary, young, ambitious, and brilliant, but also malleable. To the government, he was a genius who could transform Facebook into a global surveillance tool. To the reptilians, he was a pawn who could be shaped to serve their interests. Mark began receiving frequent visits from both sides, convinced that his collaboration was essential for humanity's evolution. As the meetings intensified, the reptilians' demands became clearer. They wanted unrestricted access to the data collected by Facebook, from consumer preferences to users' deepest emotions. With this information, they could map the human mind and create algorithms capable of predicting and even manipulating mass behaviors. The government, in turn, saw this as an opportunity to ensure global supremacy, becoming the only entity capable of controlling and anticipating revolts, social changes, and even wars. Mark was slowly convinced that this partnership was inevitable. The reptilians offered something he couldn't refuse: access to technologies that would put him ahead of any other visionary in history. They spoke of artificial intelligence so advanced that it could think like a human but with the logic of a machine. They also promised knowledge about the universe's workings, something that fascinated Mark deeply. He began to see the reptilians not as a threat, but as allies in his ambition to transform the world. Despite this, there were signs that not everything was so simple. Mark began showing signs of resistance in isolated moments, as if there was still a part of him that understood the danger of this partnership. However, the government's pressure and the allure of the reptilians were irresistible. He was convinced that Facebook would be the pillar of a new era, an era where humanity would be guided toward a better future. What he perhaps didn't understand was that, in this future, humanity would no longer have control over itself. With billions of users connected daily, Facebook became a giant social laboratory. Initially designed to connect people, the platform soon began being used to observe and manipulate behaviors on a large scale. Every like, every comment, and every interaction provided valuable data that allowed for an understanding of how people thought and reacted. What seemed like a simple pastime for users was, in fact, a complex experiment conducted by forces aiming for something much greater than mere profits. Mark Zuckerberg, now deeply involved with the reptilians and the government, knew that Facebook was much more than a social network. It was the epicenter of an unprecedented global experiment. The collected information was analyzed to identify patterns of human behavior. Algorithms studied how users reacted to news, images, and social interactions, creating detailed emotional maps. This data was then used to predict and manipulate decisions, shaping people's opinions without them even realizing it. The purpose of this experiment went far beyond targeted advertising or financial profit. The goal was to test the limits of mass psychological manipulation. With the right tools, it was possible to induce changes in opinion, foster conflicts, or even silence dissent. Everything was done invisibly, masked by seemingly harmless updates to the algorithm. The average user didn't realize they were being manipulated, believing their choices were entirely free. This was the brilliance of the experiment. One of the most disturbing aspects of this social laboratory was how human emotions were exploited. Facebook began prioritizing content that elicited strong reactions: indignation, fear, anger, or extreme joy. Internal studies showed that negative emotions, such as fear and anger, generated more engagement, and this was widely exploited. Fake news, controversies, and heated discussions were deliberately promoted, creating deep divisions among social and political groups. It was a carefully orchestrated scenario, and people were just pawns on the board. Data collection wasn't limited to public interactions. Private messages, browsing history, and even movement patterns were tracked and analyzed. The platform knew not only what users thought, but also how they might react to certain situations. This allowed for detailed simulations of future behaviors, as if each person were a variable in a massive psychological experiment. For Mark and his allies, this was more than science. It was absolute control. The transformation of Facebook into a social laboratory marked the end of users' privacy and autonomy. From the moment someone connected to the platform, their information was collected, analyzed, and used to shape their worldview. The most frightening part was that Facebook itself encouraged users to share more and more about their lives, reinforcing the idea that they were in control. But the truth was different. Every post, every interaction, every emotion expressed online was part of a much larger experiment. One of Facebook's most sinister aspects was its ability to manipulate information and, consequently, human emotions. With absolute control over what appeared on the news feed, the platform began shaping the world in its image. Fake news, exaggerated scandals, and carefully selected images were used to provoke specific reactions in users. The idea wasn't just to inform, but to control how people felt about events around them. Mark Zuckerberg knew that human emotions were the key to mass control. He was instructed by the reptilians and the government to exploit this natural vulnerability of the human psyche. Strong emotions such as fear, anger, and hope made people more susceptible to manipulation. That's why Facebook's algorithm began prioritizing content that provoked these reactions. Over time, users started being conditioned to respond emotionally to everything they saw, creating a more polarized and emotionally unstable society. A clear example of this manipulation was the use of fake news. During significant political events, such as elections, Facebook was flooded with conflicting and often fabricated information. The intention wasn't just to misinform, but to divide. People engaged in heated discussions, took sides, and reinforced their biases. In the end, the truth became irrelevant. What mattered was controlling emotions, and Facebook was at the center of this strategy. In addition to fake news, there was an even more disturbing strategy: manipulating users' moods. Internal experiments proved it was possible to alter someone's emotional state just by changing the type of content displayed in their feed. Optimistic posts could improve someone's mood, while negative content could induce sadness or anxiety. This was done without users' knowledge or consent, making them unwitting subjects in a global psychological experiment. This emotional control had a larger purpose. It wasn't just about keeping users engaged, but about preparing the ground for future manipulations. An emotionally unstable population is easier to control, more prone to accepting imposed narratives, and less likely to question. For the reptilians and their human allies, this was the perfect opportunity to implement their agendas without significant resistance. Mark knew this and still allowed the plan to continue. The manipulation of information and emotions on Facebook revealed the platform's true power. It wasn't just a tool for connection or entertainment. It was a machine for psychological control. Every emotion, every thought, and every decision users made was shaped by the algorithm, which responded to interests far greater than mere profits. For the billions of people connected to the platform, escaping this cycle was impossible. And worse, most didn't even realize they were being controlled. As Mark Zuckerberg delved deeper into the absolute control of Facebook and its shadowy partnerships, he began to lose something essential: his own identity. Close friends who knew him before the platform's rise said he had completely changed. The young visionary who passionately spoke about connecting the world had been replaced by a cold and distant figure, almost mechanical. It wasn't just a change in behavior. It seemed like something within him had been erased. At first, Mark still tried to maintain a bit of his old personality. He appeared at public events, spoke about innovations, and tried to show enthusiasm. But as Facebook grew, these appearances became rare. His words, once vibrant, turned monotonous and calculated. He was no longer the same. Every interview, every statement seemed rehearsed, as if he were following a carefully crafted script. Those around him noticed the difference, but no one dared question him. This loss of identity wasn't just emotional, but also physical. Mark began to display extreme signs of wear. His skin became increasingly pale, his eyes had a vacant stare, and his posture seemed tense, almost rigid. Some colleagues noticed he rarely slept and spent entire days locked in his office, working on something no one else could see. He was no longer Mark Zuckerberg, the young innovator. He was something else, something few could understand. The meetings with the reptilians and government agents were fundamental to this transformation. Mark was shaped by external forces, manipulated by promises of power and knowledge. The reptilians, in particular, seemed to demand more and more from him. It wasn't just information they sought, but also Mark's soul, his free will. He became the perfect intermediary, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer had the strength to resist. There were moments when Mark seemed to realize what was happening to him. During private meetings with some old friends, he would take long pauses and stare into the void, as if trying to remember something lost. "I feel like something is wrong," he reportedly said to a colleague, but he never elaborated. These rare moments of vulnerability were quickly overshadowed by his obsession with continuing to expand Facebook. It was as if he were fighting an invisible force consuming him. In the end, Mark's loss of identity wasn't just a reflection of his obsession, but a symbol of the impact absolute power can have on a person. He had become a shell of who he once was, a man controlled by forces greater than himself. What remained of his humanity was hidden beneath layers of manipulation and darkness. And for those who knew him at the beginning, this transformation was as frightening as Facebook's ultimate purpose. The entry of the reptilians into Facebook's global manipulation plan marked a point of no return. For these beings, who had observed humanity for centuries, technology represented a unique opportunity. Before, they acted subtly, influencing governments and cultures. But with platforms like Facebook emerging, they saw a chance to accelerate their plans. The social network wasn't just a control tool, but a bridge between their intentions and total domination over humanity. The reptilians saw Facebook as a global experiment where they could observe and shape human behavior without raising suspicion. For them, each user was a piece of data, a piece of the larger puzzle they sought to solve. Their objectives weren't limited to domination. They wanted to understand the human mind in its minutest details. Their advanced technologies enabled deep analyses of emotions and behavioral patterns, making Facebook the perfect instrument for their intentions. Mark Zuckerberg was handpicked to lead this experiment. He was young, brilliant, and highly impressionable. To the reptilians, he was the ideal intermediary. They began by offering knowledge and technology, irresistible promises for someone as ambitious as Mark. Gradually, he was seduced, becoming an extension of their will. But this partnership came at a cost. Mark was not only handing over control of Facebook, but also his very essence, allowing the reptilians to shape him as they saw fit. The reptilians didn't act alone. They manipulated governments and corporations to ensure the experiment proceeded as planned. The FBI and CIA, for example, believed they were in control, using Facebook as a surveillance tool. But in reality, they were being manipulated by the reptilians, who used them as pieces in a larger game. It was a meticulously orchestrated operation where no one, except the reptilians, understood the true goal. Over time, signs of their influence became more evident. Changes to Facebook's algorithms, the promotion of social divisions, and the use of data to predict behaviors were all calculated strategies. The reptilians were shaping the human world according to their intentions, preparing the ground for even greater control. Facebook was no longer a social network, but a silent weapon of psychological and emotional domination. Despite this, some people began to notice the pattern. Independent researchers and former Facebook employees noticed something strange about how the platform operated. Reports of emotional manipulation and information control began to surface, but were quickly discredited. The reptilians, using their influence, ensured that any attempt to expose the plan was labeled a conspiracy theory. To them, the experiment was still in its early stages, and its conclusion would be far darker than anyone could imagine. With almost total control over Facebook, the reptilians initiated the most sinister aspect of their plan: direct manipulation of the human psyche. They knew emotions were the key to controlling the masses, and Facebook was the perfect vehicle for exploiting this vulnerability. Every like, every comment, and every post was analyzed to identify emotional patterns. Gradually, algorithms were adjusted to influence how users felt and reacted. The manipulation was subtle, almost imperceptible. The content shown in the news feed was carefully selected to provoke specific reactions. Posts about tragedies alternated with funny memes and inspiring news. This created an emotional cycle that left users in a constant state of alertness or vulnerability. This emotional imbalance made people more susceptible to suggestions and more likely to consume content directed by the algorithms. The most disturbing technique used by the reptilians was inducing specific fears. Exaggerated news about economic crises, natural disasters, and social conflicts were promoted to keep users in a constant state of anxiety. This strategy caused people to spend more time on the platform, seeking information or emotional comfort. However, the true purpose was even more sinister: to condition the human mind to accept solutions imposed by the controllers. The manipulation of the psyche also involved suppressing critical thoughts. Posts and comments questioning dominant narratives were systematically hidden or labeled as misinformation. At the same time, content reinforcing these narratives was promoted, creating a sense of artificial consensus. This made users believe their dissenting opinions were isolated or wrong, discouraging independent thinking and promoting conformity. Another alarming aspect was using artificial intelligence to predict behaviors. The reptilians used data collected by Facebook to create detailed psychological profiles of each user. With this information, they could predict how a person would react to specific stimuli and, more importantly, how to manipulate them in the long term. It was a level of control so precise it seemed like science fiction, but it was real. Every decision, emotion, and thought was being monitored and shaped. In the end, the manipulation of the human psyche through Facebook wasn't just a control tool, but an experiment redefining what it meant to be human. By exploring our deepest emotions and shaping our thoughts, the reptilians were slowly erasing free will. People still believed they were in control of their lives, but the truth was different. They were being guided, like puppets, by a force they couldn't even comprehend. As the reptilians consolidated their control over Facebook, the true magnitude of the threat to humanity began to reveal itself. It wasn't just about surveillance or manipulation, it was about complete domination. The ultimate plan was to use Facebook as a tool to transform society into a system of total control, where every thought and action would be monitored, predicted, and, if necessary, corrected. And the most terrifying part was that no one seemed to notice what was happening. The first phase of the plan was to create a world where privacy didn't exist. Facebook had already achieved this by persuading billions of people to voluntarily share their lives. But the next step was even more disturbing, connecting all aspects of a person's life to a single digital identity. Photos, messages, financial transactions, and even biometric data would be integrated, creating a profile the reptilians could use to predict and control human behavior. Once control was complete, humanity would become entirely dependent on the system. Facebook would transform into the nucleus of all social and economic interactions. Without access to the platform, a person would be effectively excluded from society. This total dependence was what the reptilians sought, as it would make resistance impossible. People would be forced to conform, accepting imposed rules without question. There was also a spiritual dimension to this threat. By manipulating emotions and thoughts, the reptilians were effectively draining humanity's essence. They not only controlled people's actions, but also weakened their will and creativity. The ultimate goal seemed to be transforming humanity into a submissive race, incapable of thinking or acting independently. It was a form of slavery that went far beyond the physical. It was a prison of the mind and soul. Some researchers and activists tried to expose the plan, but were quickly silenced. Their Facebook accounts were banned, their posts deleted, and their reputations destroyed. Any attempt to alert the public was labeled a conspiracy theory. The reptilians had infiltrated power structures so deeply they could control any narrative. To them, humanity was already defeated. All that remained was consolidating their dominance. The imminent threat to humanity was real and approaching quickly. With each passing day, Facebook became more indispensable and omnipresent. People believed they were living their lives freely, but in reality, they were being guided toward a future where freedom would no longer exist. And by the time they realized it, it would be too late to resist. Facebook's impact on privacy and individuality was devastating. What began as a simple social network evolved into something that monitored every aspect of users' lives. Photos, conversations, preferences, and even daily habits were stored, analyzed, and used to shape decisions. The illusion of control given to users was exactly that, an illusion. In practice, every interaction was another piece of data voluntarily handed over to the system. Privacy was eroded gradually, almost imperceptibly. People began sharing more and more about themselves, believing they were connecting with friends or expressing their opinions. But behind the scenes, Facebook's algorithms were collecting and processing everything. Every word typed, every image posted was used to build detailed psychological profiles. These profiles, in turn, were sold or delivered to those who controlled the system, to be used against the users themselves. The collapse of privacy led directly to the loss of individuality. With data constantly being analyzed, users began to be shaped by recommendations, targeted content, and invisible social pressures. Their choices, which once seemed free, were now heavily influenced by what they saw on Facebook. It was as if each person was being pushed into a mold, where differences and unique thoughts were gradually erased. Individuality was also weakened by the reinforcement of mass opinions. Facebook, by prioritizing engaging content, encouraged conformity. People were led to align with larger groups, fearing ostracism or criticism. Divergent thoughts were discouraged, while popular opinions were amplified. The platform, which should have celebrated diversity, ended up promoting uniformity. This loss of privacy and individuality was exactly what the reptilians sought. For them, humanity needed to be homogeneous, predictable, and easily manipulated. Freedom of thought was an obstacle to their plans, and Facebook became the perfect mechanism to eliminate it. By transforming each person into a predictable piece of data, they ensured no significant resistance would arise against their control. In the end, the collapse of privacy and individuality left humanity vulnerable. People were no longer individuals, but parts of a larger system that used them for its own purposes. The only freedom left was the illusion that they were still in control, but in reality, every thought, every choice was carefully monitored and manipulated. The world, once full of diversity and creativity, was slowly turning into a homogeneous and controlled space, exactly as the reptilians had planned.